Hello, and welcome to this week's edition of Wednesday's Wellness Tips. I'm Julie Crane, and thank you for joining me. Now, today's video is going to last a little bit longer. Usually I try to keep them around 15 to 20 minutes, but I wanted to wrap up carbohydrates, and this one didn't seem to have a good place to break, so just expect it to go a little bit longer. But anyway, we're still in Nutrition 101, and we're doing part 4, where we are going to wrap up carbohydrates and answer a couple of questions that I've had, and maybe you've had too. And these are, why did our grandparents or great-grandparents back in the 1910s consume a third more flour and grain than we do, yet they did not experience the high rate of gluten and sensitivity, wheat sensitivity issues, and all the problems that we see in current Americans today? So that's question 1. And question 2 is, should we avoid white bread? So as I started doing my research on this topic, what I discovered was that wheat is actually very different. The wheat that we have today is very different than what was first cultivated about 10,000 years ago. I don't know if you've ever thought about it. I really hadn't. But what our ancestors ate is an entirely different type of wheat than what we have available today. And it just is, even just from a couple of generations ago, it's still very different. So let's talk about what some of those differences are. Well, the first is crossbreeding and genetic manipulation. Crossbreeding and genetic manipulation of wheat began in the 1960s. And this was done, I'm sure, with good intent to try to create a higher yielding and lower costing crop. So, of course, if you're a farmer, you're going to have a product that's going to yield higher, and that's going to cost you less, so that you have that money to, support your family. But some of those things we found out have caused issues. And part of it is that there are specific nutrients in wheat that have significantly decreased since the mid-60s. So part of that is due to this genetic manipulation and the crossbreeding of wheat. It's also due to farming practices, probably overuse of ground, and the quality of the wheat seed. And what that has led to is significant reductions in zinc, iron, copper, and magnesium. Another thing that has changed is the milling process of flour. It started to change in about the 1870s to 1890s. So originally, millstones were used to grind the wheat. And then it moved from those into using steel rollers. So it might seem that there's really nothing complicated in the production of wheat. So that's kind of what I thought, right? Is you just take the wheat kernel and you grind it up and you have flour. But that was naive of me, and I've learned that there is much more to it. So it's not just about passing the grain through the grinding device. I mean, it used to be, but now that's changed. So originally, our ancestors used these millstones to crush and grind the wheat. Later, water and windmills appeared and helped with that process. And then now currently they are using steel rollers. So they are able, through the steel rollers, to mill flour at a much faster pace. This also enables the millers to actually separate different parts of the wheat kernel. So wheat could be produced much more quickly, and the millers could cut out parts of the wheat if they chose to. So we'll talk a little bit more about what that means here in just a minute. But when society stopped making bread at home from scratch and began purchasing bread off the shelf from commercial bakeries, these companies ran into some issues. They found out that the shelf life of this flour and also of the product, the bread, was very short. And it was not cost effective because things would go bad before they could either get them to market or before people would purchase them. So they looked for solutions. And what did they do? Well, they started making what we have now, which is white flour. So let's talk a little bit about what that means. Those of you that love homemade bread and grind your own flour know that home ground flour is a product that has a really short shelf life. And before long, you'll start to see little flour mites or weevil bugs to arrive in that flour and start to live in the flour. And it's really highly recommended that once you start getting an infestation of those, that you don't use that wheat. So again, it has a really short shelf life. And this is what was happening for the commercial bakers. Now, once it was made into bread, again, the shelf life was short. So the commercial bakers began looking for solutions of how they could lengthen out the shelf life of their breads. And so they turned to preservatives to do that. So currently, we're just going to talk about some of the current preservatives that are used in our breads. So the most commonly artificial preservatives that are used are calcium propanoate and propionic acid. So calcium propanoate is actually natural occurring chemical in dairy products, but it is produced artificially or synthetically to serve as an additive for food. So this is the interesting thing. If you see a label that says something like calcium added or more calcium in this bread, what's actually happening is they're adding more calcium propionate in the loaf and then advertising it as having additional calcium in it. But keep in mind, this is a synthetic version. Calcium propionate inhibits the growth of bacteria in the foods, and therefore it will extend the shelf life. Now, propionic acid is a natural occurring carboxylic acid. It actually comes in a liquid form, and it has a rather pungent and unpleasant smell, somewhat resembling body odor. Now, propionic acid will inhibit the growth of mold and some other bacteria, and it's consumed as a preservative in both animal feed and for human consumption. So it's found in both. Now, another item that they use for preservatives is powdered ascorbic acid. Now, ascorbic acid, you may have heard of. It's out quite a bit, and it is advertised as being the same as vitamin C, but it is not. You'll find it in cold medicine. You'll find it as a preservative. You'll find it in orange juice when they claim it has additional vitamin C. So it's really important to start to understand what ascorbic acid is. I did a video on that, and so you might want to refer back to ascorbic acid versus natural vitamin C. But ascorbic acid is a synthetic version of only a small portion of what makes up vitamin C. Now, it's used in breads because it reduces the growth of microorganisms, plus it also helps the yeast rise faster. Now, not all preservatives that they use in bread are artificial. There is one that's natural, and that's lecithin. Lecithin comes from soy or egg yolks. It's often found in breads because it helps keep the bread fluffy and light, and at the same time, it acts as a natural preservative for the bread. Now, there is some controversy regarding the health of soy lecithin, and this is due to the chemicals that are used when soy is being raised, and most soy is genetically modified, and how the soy lecithin is processed requires chemicals. So we're not going to go deep into that, but I tend to avoid products that include soy lecithin, so it may be something that you want to research, or we may do that as a future topic. So what's the big deal about preservatives anyway, right? If they make our food stay fresher so that we're able to eat them and they stay on the shelf longer, why should we be concerned about that? Well, one of the issues that I want to raise, and there are more than one, is that when we look at what preservatives do, is they actually kill off bacteria or they inhibit microorganisms. And you have to remember that your gut is made of microorganisms. So when we take in preservatives through food, it's kind of like taking antibiotics. They're not selective in the bacteria that they kill, they just kill it all. And so this can affect our happy, healthy gut. So by taking in preservatives, they will kill the bacteria in our gut, oftentimes the good bacteria in our gut, and that can leave us with an imbalance. And so it can create gut problems. So that's one of the biggest reasons why preservative can cause health issues. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between flours and how they create white flour versus what was typical before, or wheat flour. So wheat flour is actually made up of all parts of the wheat berry. So there are 3 parts to the wheat berry. There is the bran, which is where most of the fiber is. This is on the outside. There's the endosperm, which is mostly just starch. And there's the germ, and this is where all the nutrients are packed in. So this contains essential amino acids, minerals, vitamins, phytochemicals, and some dietary fiber along with the outside, the bran. But the interesting thing is that no matter how many times you sift a homemade or stone ground flour, it will still retain a grayish tint, which will be more or less pronounced. So why is the flour that we buy in the store so white? Well, creating white flour involves stripping away of the bran and the germ so that only the endosperm remains. Now remember, we just talked about the bran is where the fiber is, and the germ is where all the nutrients are. And the endosperm is just the starch part. So when they make white flour, they strip away the bran, so they strip away all the fiber, and they strip away the germ that has all of the nutrients in it, leaving only the endosperm, which is the starch. So next they refine the wheat, and the wheat, this flour will actually go through over 24 refining processes. Is that 24? I had no idea. So the white or the high pressure steel rolling, and then scouring, grinding, magnetic separation, and machines actually extract this nutrient poor starchy material from the wheat or the endoderm, and they discard the nutritious seed at the center, or the wheat germ, and they also get rid of the wheat bran. So at least 25 nutrients are lost during this refining process. And this results in a high calorie, low nutrient white flour. So if you think of something else, what else is high calorie and low nutrient? Sugar. Next, and that's not even it. Next, we're going to go through a bleaching process. So they use organic and inorganic compounds in order to bleach the flour. So some of the most typical ones are potassium bromate. Now, potassium bromate is a potassium salt. It's of inorganic origin. It is highly soluble in water. And in the high heat of the baking process, this potassium bromate is transformed into potassium bromide. Now, potassium bromide is considered harmless, but the interesting thing is that the use of potassium bromate, which is what it is originally before it transforms in the baking process, is actually banned in the USA, in China, in the European states, in Canada, Russia, and Brazil. And this is because, according to animal studies, bromate can provoke the appearance of malignant tumors in the thyroid gland and kidneys in laboratory rodents. So you'll have to come to your own conclusion about how safe that is. The next product that they use or compound is benzoyl peroxide. Now, benzoyl peroxide is a white powder. It's used in the baking industry to improve the properties of the flour. It helps the flour become looser and more airy and creates a lighter shade. It's also used in the production of oil and cheese and in the cosmetic industry. However, in its pure form, it is a dangerous carcinogen. Research has already made that well known. The next product or compound that they use is ammonium persulfate. This, again, is an inorganic compound. It's also known as ammonia salts. So it is referred to as being in the third class of danger, so it isn't necessarily known as safe. And this is due to the fact that when you are inhaling ammonia salts, it is possible to develop suffocation and a strong allergic reaction. So yes, this is the same compound that you use with somebody that may have passed out, and you run it under their nose because it has such a strong odor. That's what they're using in the bread as a bleaching property. And the last one is alloxan. Alloxan is a compound that's obtained as the result of an oxygenation of uric acid. For animals, this is an extremely toxic compound. Alloxan is able to provoke necrosis of pancreatic and kidney tissues, changes in thyroid and adrenal tissues. And in addition, this substance is actually used in laboratory work to try to provoke experimental diabetes in rodents. Researchers claim that alloxan is less toxic for humans than for animals. However, studies that would definitively put that to rest have not been done. So I'll leave you to form your own conclusion on that. So I mentioned earlier about how flour mites and weevil bugs quickly get into home ground flour. But oddly enough, store-bought white flour rarely ever attracts these or other kinds of animals. What is the reason for this? Perhaps it's that the fiber, vitamins, trace elements are all gone, so even the weevil and the bugs don't want to consume it. So another issue that has changed our bread is the modern practices. Modern baking practices have actually shortened bread leavening, which means the use of a chemical yeast product rather than using a natural yeast and fermentation process. So because of that, many people have had issues. Oftentimes that quick rise of the bread does not allow for the bonds in the protein to be broken down as it does with natural yeast, such as like with the sourdough. So with the sourdough, it has more time for it to ferment and for that yeast to make it airy and light. And while it's doing that, it's actually breaking up the bonds that create some gluten issues. A lot of times people will have problems with gluten because those protein bonds are so tight that they're not able to digest the gluten. And when we put it through a natural yeast and fermentation process, a lot of those protein bonds are broken down. So this has created problems. I'm not going to get deep into gluten today. We're going to save that for a future tip, but just know that that can be some of the problems. It actually can be a problem with the chemical yeast that creates problems for people, or it can be because these proteins aren't being broken down properly. Now, commercial breads frequently contain artificial colors, added sugar, glyphosate, and other problematic ingredients. So GI symptoms such as diarrhea, cramping, abdominal pain, gas, and bloating that are often attributed to gluten issues may actually be the result of the high use of glyphosate. So most wheat today is routinely sprayed with glyphosate. That's the active ingredient in Roundup, and it is the most widely used herbicide. Researchers have found that 80 to 90% of popular wheat-based products are contaminated with glyphosate. Similarly, the Environmental Working Group examined 5 samples of dried pasta and 7 samples of cereal, and all of them they found contained glyphosate. So researchers in one study proposed that glyphosate is believed to contribute to negative changes in the gut biome, similar to what we talked about before, which may then lead to increased gluten reactivity and create nutritional and nutrient deficiencies. Now, the next issue that we see with current breads is the fortifying or enriching commercial breads and flour. This is really a poor attempt to make processed white flour a little healthier. When you see a label that indicates that the product has been fortified or enriched, it means that there has been a synthetic version of vitamins and minerals that have been added to that product to replace what was lost during processing. So how this came about is that when white flour was first introduced into the marketplace, it actually caused a great deal of sickness and even some death. So for many people, bread is a staple. Bread and flour is a staple of their diet. And what was happening, because of all the nutrients and everything was being stripped out of this flour, the lack of nutrients really was making them sick. And like I said, some even died basically from like a nutritional deficiency. So because of this, the government began taking a closer look at white flour and other refined grains, and they required that the flours be enriched or fortified, meaning that the nutrients had to be added back before they could be sold to the public. But there's two couple of issues that I want to mention about this. Number one is that the government only required that B1, B2, B3, and iron be replaced. So that certainly didn't replace all of what was being lost. And number two, they're being replaced with a synthetic. So you're removing a natural vitamin and mineral and you're replacing with a synthetic, which is oftentimes not identifiable by the body. So again, that we'll go into another tip to go deeper into the difference between synthetics and naturals, but it does create issues for the body. So I just want to share a couple of interesting studies. There was one that was done by Roger Williams, who is the author of the Physician's Handbook of Nutritional Science. And he set out to identify if there was a difference between a complete bread source, or, like a whole wheat bread source, and the standardized enriched grocery store version. And so what he found is that after 90 days on the commercial bread diet, approximately 2/3 of the study animals had died of malnutrition, or those that were still alive were severely stunted. Now, all of the rats that had been given the regular whole wheat bread with the nutrients still intact were all healthy and growing. And there are numerous other studies that show similar negative effects on humans. White flour has actually been shown to ball up in the system, much like a piece of white bread forms a gummy ball when you roll it between your palms. I remember doing this when I was a kid. I thought it was so cool. And, and you have this big ball of, dough basically, and then eat that. But that's kind of what happens in the stomach. And so it can create problems for digestion. Highly refined grains actually draw minerals out of the body, depleting important nutrients. And this is due to their need to have certain vitamins and minerals in order to process that food. And when it's not there, it's going to actually deplete it from other areas in the body. Recent studies also show that white flour, along with sugar, actually caramelizes in your system, and this can create premature aging and clogging of arteries. And in addition, white flour has been shown to contribute to cancer, stomach disorders, high cholesterol, gallbladder or gallstones, heart disease, urinary bladder stones, and ulcers. There's another study that I just want to mention because this one's really interesting. It was done back in 1943, so typically we wouldn't look at such an old study, but the results of it are interesting. So this was done by a well-known breakfast food company, and it showed similar results as to what I was just mentioning. So they had 4 sets of rats that were each given a special diet. Now, one group of rats received plain whole wheat, water, vitamins, and minerals. And these rats lived over a year on that diet. The second group was given water and vitamins only, and they lived for about 8 weeks. The third group received sugar and water, and they lived for about a month. The fourth group received refined puffed wheat cereal, vitamins, and water. They died in 2 weeks. So the study actually concluded that there was actually something toxic about eating this highly processed puffed wheat. The company that did this research has known about this for many years and still continues to market their product. So, have you ever really considered why gluten is suddenly a problem for so many people? Going gluten-free has kind of become even trendy in some circles, yet some critics claim that this trend is unsubstantiated and unnecessary. But my question is, how much do these other things that we've discussed today actually affect people's tolerance to bread and other wheat-based products, such as pasta? We know that the incidence of celiac disease remains low. Now, celiac disease is that autoimmune disease where undigested proteins from gluten triggers an immune response that leads to an attack and damage of the small intestine. But what they're finding is that wheat allergies and non-celiac gluten sensitivities appears to be increasing. So again, does it have to do with the wheat itself, the gluten itself, or does it have to do with the chemicals, the preservatives, and the other things that, the chemical yeast that are being used in the breads? I don't know. There's no research out on that yet, but that's something that I wonder about. But anyway, to kind of sum all this up, what I learned in this is that despite the presentable appearance of white flour and how delicious it is, I need to not get carried away with baking with it or using it. At best, it is simply useless, and at worst, it can cause harm to our health and damage our health. So I love a thick slice of white bread as much as anybody, fluffy and light, but I need to consider it more like sugar and eat it only on a rare basis, if at all. Switching to wheat flour and whole grain bread is better for the body, it's better absorbed, and it will provide more nutrients, minerals, and fiber to the body. So the rule of thumb for bread buying is to pick the one with the fewest ingredients and ingredients that you know what they are. Stick with whole wheat or other whole grains as the main ingredient if you have gluten concerns. Consider using ancient grains. Researchers have particularly focused on kamut, I think I'm pronouncing that right, which has less gluten and more protein than regular wheat, supposedly making it healthier and easier to digest. And ancient grain breads typically have higher quality ingredients, they're higher in fiber, and they're naturally free of gluten. And I've also learned that there's some wisdom in home grinding of wheat. So you can't avoid all the issues, but if you get a high quality wheat, you can avoid some of the issues that come from the poor quality, and grind it yourself and just grind and use it. And I have never thought that I would be somebody that wanted to do that. Why buy it? Or why go to all that work when you just go buy a bag? But after learning all this, I think I'm going to be shopping for a wheat grinder. And if I get any good information on that, I'll let you know. So let's wrap up carbs here in a nutshell. So carbs come in many forms and use various enzymes to break them down into usable nutrients. The right carbohydrate can load you up with vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. It can give you a quick or a delayed energy boost. It can help you feel satisfied, it can reduce food cravings, and it can make you healthy. The wrong carbohydrates will do the opposite. So it all depends on the type of carbohydrates you eat and whether the necessary digestive enzymes are present. The World Health Organization states that carbohydrates are extremely important in our diet, but its own study shows that 90% of our carbohydrates come from white flour and sugar instead of from healthy grains, fruits, and vegetables. So it's all about choice. It's all about making the right choice for you. So a healthy goal is to take in less than 50 grams of sugar a day without counting, the natural sugars found in fruit. So I hope that you found this helpful, and maybe you'll be able to make a decision about whether or not you think you should continue to eat white bread. I know a lot of this sounded pretty negative, but it's important for us to understand so that we can make better choices and be able to improve our health through our food choices. So join me next week when our topic will move to fats and why moderation is such a big deal. So thanks again for joining me, and have a wonderful day.